Hello and welcome back to the Godzilla Marathon, and we're going to continue with the series from where we left off. So a couple weeks ago, we covered the films Godzilla Raids Again and King Kong vs. Godzilla, which were extremely mixed in my opinions on them, as I didn't really dislike either of them, but I didn't really like either of them either. But now we are going to get to the films where the Godzilla films start to get their grip of what the Godzilla film should be. King Kong vs. Godzilla started off with the trend that the Godzilla films would be heading into, but these next two films are what perfected it for the films to come. The formula for these films, especially the Showa era films, is extremely simple and was followed by many films of that era. And while this formula works, the formula itself doesn't allow many of these films to be great and stand out like many films that don't follow a formula. The formula that this movie uses is of course that Godzilla comes back to terrorize Japan, where he usually runs into a new foe that has a weapon that defeats or weakens Godzilla the first time they run into each other, and then Godzilla defeats the foe at the very end of the film. In between those monster fight scenes are generally pretty weak and shallow plots that usually add nothing to the film, and it's just there to fill out the runtime of the film. These are the parts that when you were a kid, you generally skip to get into the big monster fight scenes of the film. Of course, that does not mean these films are bad. Quite the contrary, actually. If the film has enough monster fight scenes that are well made and truly stand out, then the film is generally quite enjoyable and makes it so it's not boring when you're watching it throughout the runtime. But if the monster scenes suck and don't add anything to the film, then films generally aren't worth watching. I mean, not all the human parts of the films suck and are worthless, but the majority of them are. So if a film has good human parts, then they are generally going to be some of the best of the franchise. But most of the films in this series do not have that. That's one of the reasons that the recent film Godzilla Minus One did so well and worked in such a great way. But in the Showa era, a film like that is much less common due to Toho limiting the budgets of many of these films, but some of the gems did come through. And I truly mean that. Don't just discount the films because it's from the Showa era. A lot of these films are great and have aged extremely well, even though the human parts can be quite boring. The special effects are what you are here for. Think of it like a Marvel movie. This is not a movie that you're going for the plot, you're going for the extremely crazy visuals that you're about to see. And you also have to remember the context surrounding these films. These are films that were mainly marketed towards children. This is not made for adults. These films are generally made to be more goofy because it was made for small kids in mind. This is not your R-rated blockbuster horror film. This is going to be your more goofy PG or G-rated film. It's not supposed to be taken that seriously. It's going to be a lot more goofy, especially as the series goes along. But there are some films that shine through, especially some that focus a little bit more on mixing the two, as they have some adult elements to them while also having a lot of elements that kids would enjoy. And two of those films are definitely Mothra vs. Godzilla and Gadora the three-headed monster. But before we go any further, let me know if you like this series. You can do that in a couple of ways. That of course being liking and subscribing, and let me know down below in the comments what you thought of the films that I was looking at. And also let me know down below your thoughts on the video. Now let's get started with the video. Mothra was a monster created for the 1961 film of the same name, and was a monster made to appeal to the female audience, which was apparently a huge movie-going force of Japan in the 60s, and the film would go on to be highly successful and make lots of money for Toho at the time. Then a couple of years later, King Kong vs. Godzilla would grow to become one of the highest grossing films in Japanese history, essentially making it so the Godzilla series would definitely continue on for quite a while. And when I say that film was massive overseas, I mean it was massive. This was the biggest film of the time. It was huge. And when looking for monsters that Godzilla could possibly face for the next film, they of course thought of Mothra, so Godzilla was brought in once again to fight the winged nemesis. But once again, like other films of the series, Godzilla is the antagonist of this film. He is once again the bad guy. He still isn't the hero in this film, and that may come to surprise to many of the viewers, as even though the series is most definitely cheesy at this point, it still hasn't fully reached the level of cheesiness that it will reach later on. This is actually the last film in the Showa era to portray Godzilla as a villain, and will be the last one for a very, very long time, because Godzilla would eventually become a more kid-friendly franchise, which this is the last film before that happened. But you can definitely feel the more kid-friendly tone coming in, as this film is much less serious than the many other films before it. There is mainly a more like child-friendly appearance to it. It's not super dark like the other films in the franchise so far, and it doesn't have the sense of humor that only adults would get. This is definitely when the franchise started to turn towards the all ages direction. You can tell by watching it, because it's not as serious as the other ones so far. Many of the monster fight scenes in this film are some of the best of the whole franchise, and I mean that wholeheartedly. Everyone remembers the fight scenes in this film, as it shows what a Godzilla fight scene from the Showa era should look and feel like. Like seriously, this is prime Showa era filmmaking. It is the most like ridiculous destruction, but it is just like a fun film to watch. It's not boring whatsoever. And while the fight scenes are not super clean, they are still extremely fun to watch. It's not super well made like the Heisei and Millennium era ones, but it still has that air of fun to it. This is also not like the Heisei or Millennium era Godzilla films with super realistic scenes of destruction that focus more on the destruction than the actual monsters themselves. The destruction of this film are just huge set pieces for the big monsters to destroy, and that's it. One of my definitely favorite scenes in this film is that instead of Godzilla just coming out of the sea like he normally does, he just randomly just pops out of the ground, scaring the shit out of everyone around him. And when I say it literally comes out of nowhere, it comes out of nowhere. He just is like, oh, I'm here now. That's essentially how the scene goes, and it just is really funny. This film also continues the time-old tradition of a Godzilla film, which is Mothra always seems to die. No matter what film Mothra is in, Mothra will always die in some sort of way to Godzilla, no matter how powerful Mothra is in that film. I don't think any of the films, besides the more Mothra-focused ones, that she actually lives in. It's almost like a running gag at this point, just how fragile Mothra is in every single film. And what's also good about this film is that unlike a lot of other films in the franchise, the human scenes aren't really boring. They might not be the best made human scenes, but they're at least somewhat interesting and keep you focused on the film. It's not just one of those films where you want to skip it all. I think the highlight of this film is definitely the scene of Godzilla destroying the extremely old city of Nagoya, and he destroys the Nagoya castle in a extremely awesome effect that looks really good as he just pushes the thing over, and it's really fun to watch. This film has many of the scenes that are missing in other Godzilla films, which is Godzilla just romping through a city and causing mass destruction to it at a crazy point. Once again, the models are on point for this film, with many of them being extremely good looking for the time and don't have that air of cheapness to them that many of the other Showa era Godzilla films have. And I'm looking at you, All Monsters Attack. It's not a perfect film, however. There are many, and I mean many, plot holes and flaws within the film. Much of the film doesn't make much sense, and it is a pretty paper-thin film plot-wise. But truly, if you are seeing a Godzilla film for the plot, you are at the wrong franchise. Seriously. Most of the Godzilla films are paper-thin anyways, and even though they might have a lot of messaging in them, most of all of it is lost behind the big monster fights and the huge set pieces. And this film has aged a lot better than many of the other vintage Godzilla films, and is definitely worth looking at. Next up is, of course, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, quite possibly my favorite Showa-era monster is the star of the film, King Ghidorah or King Ghidorah, however you want to pronounce it. The film is the first one in the series to have Godzilla be the good guy for once, as King Ghidorah is such a huge threat that even Godzilla is the good guy in comparison. Once again, though, the human plot is super paper-thin, but the film brings what is most likely the best Godzilla scenes in the franchise thus far. I mean seriously, 2 films in a row have had these amazing Godzilla scenes. They truly were on a filmmaking spree at this point. The big bad of this film is so dangerous that they have to have 3 other monsters fight off the one. King Ghidorah is a 3-headed beast with wings and is one of my favorite Godzilla monsters that shoots off lasers of destruction much like Godzilla's atomic breath. It's essentially a Godzilla with 3 heads that goes around shooting the 3 lasers to destroy the cities. And in this film, Godzilla has to enlist the help of a Mothra larvae and Rodan in order to defeat it because King Ghidorah is just too powerful. And when I say King Ghidorah has a crazy good sound cue whenever he appears, those horns that play upon his appearance have always made me love his character. It's just such a cool design, and I think for a Godzilla monster, every part of it just seems to come together to create a memorable and a one-of-a-kind monster. This isn't a Rodan or Mothra that is already based off of already living things that we have within this world. No, this is something much more alien, taking on the form of a dragon-like figure combined with something like the Hydras of mythology. But once again, the film is not perfect. The human plot of this one is quite weird and doesn't make much sense. Ghidorah is an alien in this film and comes down from inside a meteorite and begins destroying a city where it runs into Godzilla, Rodan, and Mothra on the mountains as they have a big face-off. And the human plot involves a prophet alien that possesses a princess, and she tells them and warns them about Ghidorah coming to destroy the world and gets chased by an assassin throughout the film. And as I said earlier, the plot is paper thin. The plot has almost no substance to it whatsoever, but that is forgivable with just how cool and over the top the monster scenes within this one are. Overall, a very fun movie, although it still has its flaws. I have seen way worse Godzilla films. Now let's get on with the final scores. Now in conclusion, Godzilla vs. Mothra, although not the best, has some of the best action scenes. It shows what a Godzilla film should be. 6.5 out of 10, and would recommend for first-time viewers of the series. For Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, although it has a paper-thin plot, it has some of the best monster scenes in the whole franchise. I would give it a 7 out of 10 and would highly recommend it.